In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to improve some of the rendered image quality in Maya. Okay, so as you open up your scenes and start to build and light and render your own files inside of Maya, a lot of times you'll start to find some quality issues inside of your render. So if I take this scene that we have currently, and if I were to simply come in and render this out, you can see what we would normally get with our default render settings. Now, visually, this does look pretty good. We have nice lights, nice reflections, nice shadows in here. The problem, though, is that we start to get a lot of these really prominent noise issues. You can see along the edges of our object, we start to get a lot of these very prominent sort of stair-stepping in our pixels. Now, this stair-stepping is what's called aliasing. So to remove this, we use a process called anti-aliasing. And this anti-aliasing will come in and start to smooth a lot of these edges of our pixels, start to give us a much cleaner render. So to fix this, let's start by going into our render settings. So this will pull up in our render settings window. And just to make sure that we have everything set at our absolute default values in Mental Ray, again, this is the settings that you're going to change if you're rendering inside of Mental Ray. Let's start by going to presets. Let's load preset and just start by going to the default settings. That'll make sure that everything in our render settings have been completely set back to their default values. So rendering that, this should give us, again, our completely normal default result. You can see right now my render time is just about 5 seconds. So to fix this aliasing errors or these aliasing issues, we first need to go into the Quality tab of our Mental Ray render settings, and up at the very top we have this anti-aliasing quality. Now by default this max sampling level is set to 0, and this is the primary slider, the primary attribute that we're going to need to adjust to fix these issues. So if we start with just a simple value of 1 and save this image for comparison and re-render, if you get in now just a little bit closer, you can see that we do have some stair-stepping in here still, but it's not anywhere near as bad as what we had before, if you compare what I had before to what I have now. So already we do have a slight improvement over a lot of these jagged little pixel edges. The problem, though, is that as we start to increase these sampling levels higher and higher, we'll start to see a much more dramatic slowdown in our render times. So for example, we've jumped from 5 seconds from this original low quality render. Now with a sampling level of 1, you can see my render time is increased to about 7 seconds. And as we start to increase these sampling levels higher and higher, that speed or slowdown will start to become more and more dramatic. So if I take this up to a sampling level of 2, again, save my image for comparison and re-render that, now we start to get a render that is, again, even cleaner than what we had before. Still a few minor stair-stepping issues, but really we have to zoom in really close to see that. But compared to what we had before and what we had originally, this is now a huge improvement. But again, whereas before we experienced only about a 2-second increase from sampling level 0 to sampling level 1, from sampling level 1 to sampling level 2, we experienced almost a 4-second increase, so we've almost doubled the speed difference. Now, we can take this sampling level up even higher if we need to, although for most situations I find that this sampling level of 2 is going to be pretty acceptable for just about every situation. There may be some rare instances where you might need to take this up even a little bit higher to something like 3, but for probably 95% of the rendering, maybe even more than 95% of the rendering that I do, I usually will leave the sampling level at a maximum value of 2. Now, just to illustrate this, if we were to take this up to something like 4, and again, save my image for comparison and re-render, at this point we should see a very large increase in our render time. So you can see my render is moving extremely slow at this point. And the fact is that the quality difference that we get between a sampling level of 4 and a sampling level of 2 is going to be very small, maybe even unnoticeable. And you can see once that render finally finishes up, this was able to render out in about 1 minute compared to sampling level 2, which rendered in just about 11 seconds. And honestly, if you take a look between these two, you'll see almost no difference. You'd have to get in here really, really tight to spot any sort of a difference between sampling level 4 and sampling level 2. So again, for almost every situation that you encounter, you'll probably want to leave this down at sampling level 2, just so you can get that great mixture of speed and quality in your renders. So this is where you'll find these settings if you happen to be rendering in MentalRay. Now, if you are rendering using something like Maya software, these settings are a little bit different. So to illustrate this, I'm going to switch this over to Maya software, render this out, and you notice that a lot of my pieces on this aircraft disappear. That's completely normal. That's only because a lot of these different pieces are using special MentalRay materials which can't be rendered in Maya software, so as a result they just disappear. But this will still give me the chance to illustrate sort of the aliasing settings that are found in Maya software. Again, by default we get these really, really bad aliasing artifacts, really noticeable stair-stepping in a lot of these pixels. So the aliasing settings in Maya software are going to be found inside this Maya software tab. And we do have some controls here for medium quality, high quality aliasing, and we can start to get into some of the different shading samples and starting to change these and bump these up. But really I find that if I'm rendering in Maya software, which honestly is not very often, I primarily prefer to use MentalRay, but if we do use these aliasing settings inside of Maya software, you can just access these through this quality pull-down menu. So if I go to something like preview quality, you can see it will go in and set all the aliasing settings accordingly. If I go to intermediate quality, again, production quality, and you can see it starts to turn on and change a lot of these different settings automatically. I find that, again, for most situations, something like the production quality will work just fine. You can go higher as you start to get into contrast sensitive and 3D motion blur, but again, you'll see a very, very significant performance hit with these guys, and honestly, you'll see almost no quality increase over those. But if I set that to a production quality and save this, render out this new image, you can see big, big difference between what we had before and what we have now. Okay, so for the most part, really, when you're working in MentalRay and doing your rendering work, you will start with these low quality settings, and my personal recommendation to you would be to actually leave these at a fairly low value, at least when you're starting out in your renders. That way your renders can move as quickly as possible and you can get the fastest possible feedback as you're starting to set up your lights, set up your materials, and then only once you reach a point where you really start to get to a point where you need to see more detail, then you can start to gradually bring these levels up. And once you're ready to finally make your final render, then you can start to bump these sampling levels up to something like 2, and then shoot out your final render. Okay, so that's a look at how we can start to reduce these aliasing artifacts in Maya.